I was just looking for an old box of photos in the attic. Nothing more, nothing less. But when Nathan appeared in the doorway, everything changed. His comment, simple yet loaded, "You were stunning back then," caught me off guard. I laughed it off, but the look in his eyes told another story. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a shift, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Something I wasn't ready to face. My name is Eleanor, and for years I lived in quiet simplicity. At 56, I'd resigned myself to a life of routine. Gardening in the mornings, reading novels in the evenings, and attending family gatherings that always ended with me coming home to an empty house. My husband, Jonathan, had been my anchor, though often distant and preoccupied with his work. When he passed away 2 years ago, the silence he left behind felt like a permanent fixture in my life. I tried to fill the void with small distractions, tidying up forgotten corners of the house, organizing closets, and even attempting a few home repairs. But nothing could quite shake the hollowness that lingered. I told myself that this was simply the way life was meant to be now. Quiet, predictable, lonely. Then Aaron arrived. Jonathan's nephew, Aaron, was 28, a man with restless energy and an easy charm that felt out of place in the stillness of my home. He'd come seeking an escape from the chaos of the city, a break from the fast pace of his life. At first, he kept to himself, wandering the woods and reading on the porch, but slowly we began talking. Small conversations turned into long discussions, and I found myself looking forward to the moments we shared. Aaron was nothing like Jonathan. Where my husband had been reserved, Aaron was open and attentive. He listened in a way that made me feel seen, his green eyes steady and thoughtful. It was disarming, this sense of being noticed after years of fading into the background. One afternoon, while I struggled to fix the creaky fence in the garden, Aaron appeared beside me, offering to help. He worked silently but with purpose, his presence calming yet commanding. I couldn't help but notice the ease with which he moved, the way his focus never wavered. And as our conversations deepened, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. A lightness, a sense of possibility. I didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to the novelty of having someone around. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore the quiet pull between us. Something was changing, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. As the days passed, Aaron's presence became a fixture in my life. He was always there, helping with the small tasks I'd grown used to doing alone, striking up conversations that stretched long into the evening. It was comforting, but it was also unsettling. I couldn't quite place why, but something about the way he looked at me made me feel both seen and exposed in a way I hadn't experienced before. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the hills, Aaron turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever feel like there's more out there?" he asked, his voice quiet. "More out there?" I echoed, unsure of what he meant. He nodded. "More to life. More than just routines and expectations." I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I suppose I used to," I admitted finally. "But I think I gave up on that idea a long time ago." Aaron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied me, his green eyes steady and unyielding. "Maybe it's not too late," he said softly, his tone laden with meaning. His words lingered in the air, and I felt my cheeks flush. I laughed it off, turning my gaze back to the horizon. "It's easy to say that when you're 28, I replied, trying to keep the moment light. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that his words meant more than I was willing to admit. Over the next few days, I found myself increasingly aware of Aaron's presence. The way he moved through the house, his easy laughter, the way his eyes seemed to follow me when he thought I wasn't looking, it all left me off balance. He was attentive in a way that felt different, more deliberate, and it stirred something in me I wasn't ready to confront. One rainy afternoon, as I sorted through old boxes in the attic, Aaron appeared in the doorway. His shirt clung to his skin from the summer heat, and there was a small, knowing smile on his lips. "Need some help?" he asked, stepping inside before I could answer. I nodded, grateful for the distraction. Together, we worked in comfortable silence, sorting through the dusty remnants of a life that felt far removed from the present. At one point, Aaron pulled out an old photo of me from my 20s, his expression softening as he studied it. "You were beautiful," he said, his voice low and sincere. I laughed, brushing off the comment. "That was a long time ago." "It doesn't matter," he replied, meeting my gaze. "You still are." There was something in the way he said it, something unspoken but undeniable. The air in the room shifted, and I felt my pulse quicken as I turned back to the box in front of me, unsure of how to respond. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I couldn't shake the weight of the moment we'd shared. Aaron sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album I had left out. His fingers moved gently over the pages, pausing now and then to study a picture. "Is this your wedding day?" he asked, holding up a photo of Jonathan and me standing in front of the church. I nodded, keeping my focus on the pot simmering on the stove. "It was a lifetime ago." "You look happy," he said, though there was a hint of something else in his tone, curiosity, perhaps, or sadness. "We were," I replied, forcing a smile. "In our own way." He closed the album and leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me. "And now?" I froze, my hands trembling slightly as I chopped the vegetables. "And now, I'm figuring out what comes next," I said carefully. The weight of his gaze was almost too much to bear, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying. And as I stood there, pretending to focus on dinner, I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced every time he was near. Something had shifted between us, and no matter how hard I tried to push it away, it refused to be ignored. The days after that evening felt heavier, as though an invisible thread now connected me and Aaron, pulling tighter with each shared glance or fleeting touch. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just reading too much into moments that didn't mean anything. But the truth was harder to dismiss. Each interaction seemed to carry a weight I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, a summer storm rolled in, forcing us to stay indoors. I was in the living room, sorting through old books, when Aaron joined me. He knelt beside me, his movements unhurried as he picked up a stack of novels. "Need help?" he asked, his voice warm and familiar. I smiled, handing him a pile. "These can go in the donate box." As we worked, our hands brushed more than once. Each accidental touch sent a jolt through me, and I could feel my resolve weakening. Aaron must have noticed my unease because he paused, his hand lingering on a book as he looked at me. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his tone gentle but insistent. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I'm fine," I said finally, though my voice betrayed me. He didn't press further, but the way he looked at me made it clear he wasn't convinced. His gaze lingered for a moment before he turned back to the pile of books, but the tension in the air remained. Later that evening, as the rain drummed against the windows, Aaron and I sat on the couch watching a movie. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the screen casting shadows on the walls. The blanket we shared draped over our legs, and I could feel the warmth of his body beside me. It was comforting, but it was also overwhelming. At one point, the blanket slipped, and Aaron leaned forward to adjust it. His hand brushed against my leg, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through me. I froze, my breath hitching as he turned to me, his green eyes searching mine. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The way he was looking at me, steady, intent, vulnerable, left me unsteady. "You don't have to say anything," he continued, his hand resting lightly on mine. "But I need you to know, you're not alone. You don't have to be." The sincerity in his voice broke something in me. I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away, my heart pounding in my chest. His words were so simple, yet they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything," he repeated, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "Just tell me if it's too much. Tell me and I'll stop." I should have told him to stop. I should have pulled away. But instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, the warmth of his hand grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. When his lips brushed against mine, it was hesitant, almost cautious, as if he were giving me one last chance to walk away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, each moment stretching into eternity. His hands moved to my shoulders, his touch firm yet gentle, and I felt myself melting into him, the world outside disappearing into nothingness. For the first time in years, I felt alive, as though the walls I had built around myself were crumbling, leaving me bare and vulnerable but free. When we finally pulled away, the silence between us was thick with unspoken emotions. Aaron's forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice filled with both regret and longing. "For what?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "For complicating things," he said. "For making this harder for you." I shook my head, tears slipping down my cheeks. "It's not just you," I admitted. "I'm just as much to blame." His hand moved to my cheek, wiping away a tear with his thumb. "I don't want to make your life harder," he said softly. "But I can't pretend I don't feel this way." I looked into his eyes, the intensity of his gaze making my heart ache. There was so much vulnerability there, so much longing. And in that moment I realized I felt the same. "I don't know what this means," I said finally. "I don't know where this goes." "Then let's figure it out together," he replied, his voice steady and certain. The rain outside had softened to a gentle drizzle, the house quiet save for the sound of our breathing. As we sat there, the weight of our decisions settling over us, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the start of something we couldn't stop. The house was still, save for the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows. I stood in the kitchen, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter. The kiss Aaron and I had shared earlier still lingered in my mind, a mixture of warmth and guilt twisting in my chest. It wasn't supposed to happen. It couldn't happen. Yet it had, and there was no way to take it back. I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me and turned to see Aaron standing in the doorway. He looked hesitant, his green eyes searching mine for some sort of reassurance. The tension between us was palpable, thick and unrelenting. "We need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, stepping closer. "I know." I motioned for him to sit at the table, and we faced each other in silence, the unspoken weight of what had happened hanging heavily between us. I struggled to find the words, to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. "Aaron, what happened?" I began, my voice faltering. "It can't happen again." His jaw tightened, and I saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes. "Why not?" he asked softly. "You can't tell me you didn't feel it too." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It doesn't matter what I felt," I said firmly. "What matters is that it was wrong. This isn't who I am." "You're not giving yourself enough credit," he said, his voice low but steady. "You've spent so long putting everyone else first, burying your own needs. Don't you think it's time to stop?" His words stung because they were true. For years, I had pushed my own happiness aside, convincing myself that it was enough to be the steady, reliable presence in everyone else's life. But now, faced with Aaron's unrelenting honesty, I felt exposed in a way I wasn't prepared for. "This isn't just about me," I said finally, my voice trembling. "It's about you too. About your future, your life. If anyone found out." "I don't care what anyone thinks," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I care about you." I froze, his words hitting me like a physical blow. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe him. But the reality of our situation quickly pulled me back. "This will ruin us," I said softly. "Both of us." "Only if we let it," he countered, leaning forward, his green eyes burning with intensity. "We can figure this out, Eleanor. Together." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to throw caution to the wind and let myself feel everything I had spent years suppressing. But the risks were too great, the consequences too heavy. And then, as if to punctuate my thoughts, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Janet, my neighbor, walked into the kitchen, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden. Her cheerful expression faltered as her eyes darted between me and Aaron, her smile fading into confusion. "Oh," she said, her voice hesitant. "I didn't realize you had company." Aaron stood quickly, stepping back from the table. "I was just helping Eleanor with something," he said, his tone measured. Janet's eyes lingered on me, her expression unreadable. "Well, I just wanted to drop these off," she said, setting the basket on the counter. "I'll let you get back to whatever you were doing." The awkwardness in the room was suffocating. I forced a smile, thanking her as she turned and left, the sound of the door closing behind her leaving us in silence once again. My hands trembled as I leaned against the counter, my heart racing. "She knows," I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. "She saw us, Aaron." "She didn't see anything," he replied, his tone calm but resolute. "And even if she did, it doesn't matter." "It does matter." I snapped, my voice rising. "You don't understand what this could mean, for both of us." Aaron stepped closer, his expression softening. "Eleanor, listen to me," he said gently. "We can handle this. Whatever comes, we can face it together." I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "You don't know that," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't know what people will say, what they'll think. And I can't live with that." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, the house silent except for the sound of our breathing. Finally, Aaron reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "I know you're scared," he said softly. "But you're not alone. Whatever happens, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." His words broke something inside me. I felt the tears spill over, and I pulled my hand away, shaking my head. "I need time," I said finally. I need to figure out what this means, what I want. Aaron nodded, his expression pained but understanding. Take all the time you need, he said quietly. I'll be here when you're ready. He stepped back, giving me space, and the distance between us felt like a chasm. As he left the room, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall, I sank into a chair, my head in my hands. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, leaving me breathless. I knew there was no going back to the way things were. The line we had crossed couldn't be uncrossed, and the choices we made now would shape everything that came next. The question was whether I was brave enough to face the consequences, or if I would let fear keep me from reaching for what I truly wanted. The days that followed were a mix of unbearable tension and aching silence. Aaron gave me space, retreating to the guest room or disappearing for long walks in the woods. I knew he was trying to respect my need for time, but his absence only made the weight of my thoughts heavier. Each moment alone was filled with endless questions. What had we done? What did it mean? And, most painfully, what would happen next? Janet's unexpected arrival hung over me like a storm cloud. Her expression of confusion, the way she had glanced between us, it all felt like a ticking time bomb. She hadn't said anything since that evening, but the small town we lived in thrived on gossip. It was only a matter of time before whispers began to spread. The very thought made my chest tighten with anxiety. I busied myself with chores, trying to distract my racing mind. Cleaning the house, tending to the garden, reorganizing the attic, anything to avoid facing the truth. But no matter how hard I worked, Aaron's presence was impossible to ignore. Every time I caught sight of him, his shoulders tense as he stood on the porch, or the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking, I felt the same mix of guilt and longing that had been plaguing me since the night we kissed. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned to find Aaron standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of sadness and determination. "Eleanor," he said softly, "we can't keep avoiding this." I set down the knife I was holding, my hands trembling. "What do you want me to say, Aaron?" I asked, my voice breaking. "That I regret it? That I don't think about it every second of the day?" He stepped closer, his green eyes filled with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I don't want you to regret it," he said. "I just want you to be honest, with me and with yourself." The words hit me like a blow, and I felt the tears welling in my eyes. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to make sense of any of it." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "Then let me help," he said. "We don't have to figure it all out right now. We just need to take it one step at a time." I pulled my hand away, shaking my head. "It's not that simple," I said. "You're young, Aaron. You have your whole life ahead of you. You can't throw it all away for this." "You think I haven't thought about that?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "You think I don't know what's at stake? I've thought about it every single day since I came here. And I still know that I want you." His confession left me speechless, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I felt the pull of his words, the weight of reality was impossible to ignore. "This isn't just about us," I said softly. "It's about everyone else. About what people will say, what they'll think." Aaron's expression softened, and he stepped closer. "I don't care what people think," he said. "All I care about is you." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me, and I felt the tears spill over. "I wish it were that simple," I whispered. "But it's not." The rest of the evening passed in silence, both of us retreating to separate corners of the house. I couldn't bring myself to eat dinner, the tension in my chest making it impossible to stomach anything. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my mind. He cared about me. He wanted me. But what did I want? The following morning, the weight of my indecision felt unbearable. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring out at the oak tree in the backyard. Its branches swayed gently in the breeze, and I thought of the day we had planted it, all those years ago. Back then it had symbolized hope, growth, and new beginnings. Now it felt like a silent reminder of everything I was afraid to face. Aaron walked into the kitchen, his hair damp from a morning shower. He paused when he saw me, his expression cautious. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then finally he broke the silence. "I'm going to leave for a while," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I think we both need space." My chest tightened at his words, and I felt the sting of tears threatening to fall. "You don't have to do that," I said softly. "Yes, I do," he replied. "I don't want to pressure you, Eleanor. I want you to have the time and space to figure out what you want." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As he left the room, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me: relief, sadness, and a deep sense of loss. I knew he was right. We couldn't move forward until I had faced my own fears and made peace with what had happened. The house felt emptier after Aaron left, the silence more oppressive than ever. But in that silence, I began to confront the truth. I had spent so much of my life denying my own needs, convincing myself that it was enough to care for others. Now, for the first time, I was forced to ask myself what I truly wanted, and whether I was brave enough to reach for it. The days stretched into weeks after Aaron's departure, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the quiet ache in my chest. The house felt larger, emptier without him, and I found myself drawn to the spaces where his presence lingered. The porch where we had shared long conversations, the attic where his words had unlocked something within me, and the kitchen table where so many unspoken emotions had hung between us. I spent those weeks reflecting, unraveling the tangled threads of my emotions. I thought about Aaron's words, his willingness to risk everything for what he felt for me. And I thought about myself, how long I had spent burying my own desires, convincing myself that my life was complete in its quiet simplicity. His presence had stirred something in me, something I could no longer deny, a longing to feel alive again. But there was also fear. Fear of judgment, of rejection, of stepping into a future that felt so uncertain. I replayed every moment we had shared, every touch, every glance, and I asked myself the same question over and over. Was I willing to take the risk? One crisp autumn morning, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods behind the house, the cool air biting at my cheeks. The oak tree swayed gently in the breeze, its golden leaves fluttering to the ground. I thought of the day Aaron and I had walked through these woods, the way he had looked at me with such quiet intensity, and the way his words had stayed with me. It's never too late. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway startled me from my thoughts. I turned to see Aaron stepping out, his expression cautious but hopeful. My heart raced as he approached, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. "Hi," he said softly, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Hi," I replied, my throat tight. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us. Then, finally, I found the courage to say what I had been holding on to since the day he left. "You were right," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not too late. I don't know where this leads, but I don't want to keep running from it." Aaron's eyes softened, and he took a cautious step closer. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low, as though he were afraid of breaking the moment. "I'm sure," I said, tears stinging my eyes. For so long, I told myself that I didn't deserve more, that it was too late for me to start over. But you made me see things differently. You made me see myself differently. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and grounding. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together." The weight I had been carrying for years seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. As we stood there beneath the oak tree, the golden leaves falling around us like confetti, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The weeks that followed weren't without challenges. There were moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether we were doing the right thing. But each time, Aaron was there, steady and unwavering, reminding me that we were in this together. Slowly, I began to let go of the fear that had held me back for so long. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream again. To imagine a future that wasn't dictated by the expectations of others, but by what felt right for me. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was enough. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the hills, Aaron turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. I shook my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. "No," I said. "Not for a second." As the sky faded to shades of orange and pink, I realized that life didn't have to follow a script. Sometimes it took an unexpected detour to show you what you truly needed. And sometimes the most complicated choices led to the most beautiful beginnings. If you were in her position, what would you have done? Would you take the risk for love, or let fear guide your choices? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more compelling stories that dive deep into the complexities of human emotions. Stay tuned for our next story. It's one you won't want to miss.